If you go to an indigenous system, and the duality is always too simplistic, but you look at prosperity of creation. So, okay, we're going to run out of fossil fuel, but we got wind, we got solar, we got stuff we haven't even developed yet, but you also look at a kinship-based, interrelated sense of enoughness. And if you look at the way an indigenous economy is designed, it's designed to meet the most needs for the most people. And so the principles, the very, very sophisticated redistribution of wealth principles from the get-go, anthropologists call it sharing. Throughout the society, there's customs and cultures and rituals about sharing, but throughout the economy is redistribution of wealth.
Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo.
And I'm your co-host, Rachel Donald.
Bring you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today's guest on the newscast is Indigenous advocate and economist Rebecca Adamson. She is the founder of the nonprofit organization First Nations Development Institute, which in 1985 created the first microenterprise loan fund in the U.S., the Lakota Fund. She joins us today to discuss the trending idea of the financialization of nature, which has even made its way into proposed policy. Earlier this year, the New York Stock Exchange withdrew an application to create rules that would have designated a new nature-based asset class, controlled by natural asset companies. The idea of putting a dollar amount on nature that can be traded is viewed with much skepticism for reasons outlined by Adamson. She discusses the fundamental ethical problems such an idea poses and how a market-based valuation of nature goes against the actual finite reality of it. In this discussion with co-host Rachel Donald, Adamson proposes instead principles of indigenous economic systems, how they're designed to meet the most needs of the most people, and based on sustainable usage and respect for nature, rather than continual and unsustainable exploitation of it. It is a fantastic discussion, and I really hope you enjoy it.
Rebecca, welcome to the show. It's so great to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward. I've been counting the days since we set this up. I'm very excited.
Yeah, me too. And I think that the story that we should tell here should be in two parts. So first of all, this attempt to financialize nature, what that means, what we're seeing in the United States, and I can speak a little bit to what we're seeing in Europe. And then the proposal that you are bringing forward of indigenous economics and explaining that. How does that sound as a layout for what we're about to do?
Perfect. Thank you. I really appreciate the airtime and the platform for this. I think most of what I'm going to talk about makes tremendous practical sense, but there's no room for that within the market conversation that's going on over here right now.
Well, I mean, let's start there. What is the market conversation that's going on right now?
I think there's really a strong push to financialize Mother Nature. Now, where we saw a breath-holding moment here for us was when they applied to the Securities Exchange Commission in 2021 to designate nature and nature's benefits as an asset class.
The New York Stock Exchange proposed the idea in 2021 of a natural asset class based on ecosystem services, the rights of which would be held by natural asset companies, NACs, which would be co-defined by them and the U.S. firm Intrinsic Exchange Group. In 2023, the New York Stock Exchange officially filed proposed rule changes with the SEC to adopt listing standards for these NACs.
That was mind-boggling to most of us in the field and to most of us who care about Mother Earth. The idea that this was moving so fast to commodify every bit of her was gut-wrenching, actually. I'd like to put it on economic terms first, but it was just like a kick in the gut. There's an addiction to the market in this country that is unhealthy. And if you follow the thinking on this, the first part that was jaw-dropping was they did a valuation of nature and nature's benefit as an asset class. And they came up with $4,000 trillion.
This figure is actually $5,000 trillion.
So you have to fold in then the fact that it's all of life. It's me, it's you. We're talking about everything here. And they were able to come up with a valuation on this. It's mind-bogglingly theoretical with people lined up. It reminds me of the old days, in the medieval days when they were still following medicine according to a 2,000-year-old book that Socrates wrote. I mean, the evidence says it's going to kill the patient. Okay, but the book says we do this.
Yeah.
It just, there's such a disconnect between evidence-based results when they're dealing with Mother Nature and trying to financialize her. So it went for about two years, really under consideration by SEC. The frightening part was it was denied. The application was denied, but not on any merit or actually demerit in the thinking, but because out west, the Western states' political forces realized that that was money out of their pocket. It wasn't a case of we have to protect our wildlands and our prairies and our mountains, but it was money out of our pocket because we're getting huge Bureau of Land Management below market leases. We can sell the water any way we want.
As reported on by E&E News Politico, in early 2024, the Republican attorneys general from 25 U.S. states all signed a letter to the SEC strongly urging them to reject the proposal, claiming that it could enable companies whose purpose is not to make money, but instead to lock up land to prohibit productive economic uses, and accusing the Bureau of Land Management of trying to create a scheme to issue, quote, illegal conservation leases. The SEC and the New York Stock Exchange later withdrew the proposal on January 17th of this year.
So it really was denied for all the wrong reasons, but, a breath of relief, it was denied. Meantime, on a longer track over here that has been started before, they probably were started around the same time, and it comes from the ecological economists having constantly tried to fit this into an economic framework. The most simple thing would be to fit your economy into a living, breathing, natural physics law framework. And if you look at the indigenous economies, they really talk about balance and harmony. And those aren't quaint customs. Those are design principles. So what we need to be doing here is beginning to look at our design principles of our economic system in terms of balance and harmony with the whole, all of Mother Nature. But instead, they've been looking at the sort of how to fit this into the economy because they say the economy is what will give it value. Now, the fallacy in that assumption is the number one rule they tell you in Economics 101 is the market is value neutral. So if you're pushing it into a system that claims to be value neutral, how's it going to give it a value? What that means in reality is value neutral means, first of all, it's humanly impossible for us to be value neutral, and this is a man-designed system. But when you strip away values, they're talking about caring about the forest, living in moderation around nature. Value neutral means we only have one value, and that's profit. And it's a singular measurement, and it's a singular goal. And the system is designed for that. So if we start pushing nature as a wholesale commodity into this system, everything then comes up against the fact that, first of all, the fact that destroying it isn't going to have any value. I mean, this is why actually a massive oil pollution is good for the economy, because the actual nature that it is destroyed isn't valued, but the cleanup costs are.
Yeah.
So you take this system that says it's value neutral, and I actually think it was a little bit like the Catholic world, again, back in medieval times where the Pope was infallible. They've always wanted to get this system to where it's not accountable to anything. This system runs by itself and it's not accountable. It's value neutral, just the market made me do it. Kind of like the devil made me do it. The market made me do it. It's not my fault I've raped and pillaged the entire planet. It's a market force. So you look at that market force and you continue this path that's value neutral, and you get to the primary tool for measuring it, which is the GDP. Well, you take the GDP and you realize it's a double entry bookkeeping system. There's expenses and there's revenue. And when you look at how they define that, the way they define expenses and the way they define revenue puts us in a system. Well, an easy one is for you and I, most women's work at home is not defined as revenue or value or investment. Men's work is many times. New construction is revenue, but remodeling isn't. So the system itself and how they define which side of the ledger it's going to go into really controls the value of it. Now you have that example I gave earlier where the pollution cleanup is revenue. The damage that was done isn't on the ledger book. So if we continue with the fact that the GDP values weapons, values whiskey, the values that are in there by way of revenue, where expenses are education, and then let's go to the next one, health. You privatize health, which we have over here, and you escalate the profit or the expenses exponentially so that the profit rises to the top, and it's not reinvested back into our medical services or our medical system at all. This is what we're going to do to nature, Rachel. We're going to put this in a system where we extract as much of this one idea of value, which is the profit side of it, and with nothing in reciprocity or reinvestment coming back into it. That's what financialization of nature is going to enter. It's like a meat grinder. We're going to be putting it into this meat grinder. We're going to be grinding it all up and parceling it out.
Yes. And I mean, you're saying going to be, I think what's so frightening about the financialization of nature and also of the crisis, the financialization of the biodiversity crisis, the water crisis, the climate crisis, the political crisis. I mean, it is just astonishing, is that this transformation of the abundance of nature into individual wealth or sovereign property or just destruction, essentially, is already how the economic system functions. That is coded upon destruction in order to generate profit, as you're saying. And thus, like tinkering with it, putting words to that, it's not going to solve the fundamental problem, which is that if you live on a planet where people in charge think that they can put a number to it, as if we had to pay $4,001 trillion, then we wouldn't do it because it wasn't financially viable. And then you could say goodbye to all of life. I mean,
it's like you said, mind-boggling, because they put the $4,000 trillion value to it without blinking an eye. That's their life too. It's your life. It's my life. It's everything, boys. Everything.
I think that's it. I mean, how divorced nature is, or life is, from our economies is something, a kind of narrative problem or a deep, deep misunderstanding, which I think is driving or at least facilitating a lot of the continuation of bad decisions being made. But one question I want to ask you is, because I get asked this quite a lot, but if that is the currency that these people who are making decisions understand, money, profit, ledgers, then why is putting a price on nature bad? Because surely, because this is what people say to me, surely if we put the correct price on nature, then it will be saved. So maybe you can give a better answer than I ever can to that question.
Well, that's kind of the argument they're making, is that, well, this will be so expensive, it'll be safe. However, if you look at when you put something in the market and it starts to make a profit, you want to put more of it in the market. So when we did the carbon offsets, we actually want more carbon because it's good for the market. So what happens in that dynamic is that by putting this, and the other end of this is, let me say right up front, we're going to run out. So you can't just keep putting it in the market because it makes the economy grow. There is a finite point here where we have to take care of it. I think a lot of it, my background is Indigenous. And so I've worked always within an economy that's within an Indigenous worldview. And it was interesting. 1986, World Wildlife Fund brought together all the great religions. It was Christianity, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Judaist. And they were looking for a declaration about how a religious core teaching that could bring us into nature and in relationship with nature. And they met in the Umbria Hills in Italy, and they were there like two days. And the outcome was there is no core belief for our way of life being within the whole in any of the great religions.
This event, which was held in Assisi, Italy, culminated in what is referred to as the Assisi Declarations. Each religion that Rebecca just mentioned created its own declaration on nature. Many point to the fact that humanity is dependent on it and also failing to protect it. Reverend Lanfranco Serini reportedly said, quote, "No one pretends that our respective beliefs are or can be held in common, but we do believe that religious concern for the conservation and ecological harmony of the natural world is our common heritage, our birthright, and our duty." New York Times, 1986.
And so we have this paradigm where we're separate from all of nature. And that's really at the crux to this, Rachel. We really have to come to realize, and that doesn't have to be religious or spiritual. In an agnostic sense, just look at the evidence. If we run out of water, you're dead pretty quickly. And the way we're going at this, there's a very good chance that the water's going to hit a tipping point in the market, and it's either going to take us direct to a recession or total market collapse within the next 4 years.
A landmark report from the Global Commission on the Economics of Water released last year says that because of a variety of reasons, including the fact that we've changed rainfall patterns and have failed to preserve freshwater ecosystems, the entire world could see a 40% shortfall in freshwater by 2030.
I mean, the interrelated risk that's in the market now would indicate it's not all free, boys, and you can't keep going, boys, because there's 4 truths in the market. It's demographic. The demographics are shifting. Huge, massive shifts in demographics across the world. Phenomenally increased amount of pressure on natural resources. I can't even describe the degree of the pressure that's growing on our natural resources. Capital shifts are enormous now. Millions are nothing. Billions are nothing. We're going to be talking about $1 trillion of shifts taking place. And the 4th one is, this means a new kind of risk. This means an interrelated risk that they're not set up to even gauge right now. So, okay, you don't want to go into the spirituality of life. Like you said, it's all destruction. If we stay even in that mindset, the risk is going to be phenomenal, and they're not equipped. They don't have the capacity to think in that interrelated kind of risk. For instance, what climate is doing to water, precipitation, floods, that all affects agriculture. That's a whole economy. That's a whole sector that they're investing in. And they can't seem to put the relation together on that. And with the people, I mean, you look at those 4 shifts or the 4 hard truths of what's happening now, and they're all driven in an interrelated fashion. So the market is ill-equipped to deal with the realities of today. And we're now living in the realities that you and I would see it as a holistic life force. But regardless, we're living in a reality that's really driven in an interconnected way.
I would love then to be able to broadcast to our listeners what an Indigenous economics looks like. How can we invite these principles of design and harmony into such a interconnected global scale problem? What are some of the principles that we can roll out that, would change the way we think about this tomorrow?
Well, it starts back with the paradigm. If you go into this world that is about death and destruction, you have a paradigm that's about scarcity of resources. You talked about abundance, blew me away. That doesn't exist in the economy. The economy, everybody knows the 2 rules are scarcity of resources and individual insatiable appetites. That's self-fulfilling if you look at what we got going here. because that is a belief system that drives competition and hoarding. You got to get yours before he does because we're going to run out. And then you just hoard. And the system is designed within that belief system of accumulation is rewarded first and foremost. If you go to an indigenous system, and the duality is always too simplistic, but you look at prosperity of creation. So, okay, we're going to run out of fossil fuel, but we got wind, we got solar, we got stuff we haven't even developed yet, but you also look at a kinship-based, interrelated sense of enoughness. And if you look at the way an indigenous economy is designed, it's designed to meet the most needs for the most people. And so the principles, the very, very sophisticated redistribution of wealth principles from the get-go, anthropologists call it sharing. Throughout the society, there's customs and cultures and rituals about sharing, but throughout the economy is redistribution of wealth. And we've mapped this in societies before. Now it's funny, when I was looking at really pulling out the design principles of a subsistence economy, it's everybody owns Mother Earth. Nobody can sell Mother Earth. You have these fluid usage rights. One clan can fish here. One clan can do berry picking here. But the usage rights are fluid. And the fact you're born gives you usage rights into the clan. And again, that like a whale hunt, it's distributed on traditional practice, but it also is distributed. We counted it with the University of Alaska, how many points in a village the whale meat gets distributed, and you literally can't count it all. We also track cash in the same village, and you can count the cash distributed on both your hands, period. Because you're looking at over here a system. What's the distribution mechanisms in our market economy? Taxes.
Hey.
One. Yeah. And when you talk to economists about it, they say, oh yeah, we could measure distribution, but we're not interested. Distribution is what produces sustainability. There is absolutely enough to go around. We just choose not to do it. And it's designed for accumulation. I mean, because you go back to that basic paradigm. So I was giving this talk in San Francisco once, and I got home and I get this call, and this fellow calls me and he says, "Hi, I'm Dee Hawk. I heard you were talking about me." Dee Hawk was the mastermind behind, back in the 60s, all the credit card industry was going bankrupt because each bank was issuing its own credit card. It was highly territorial, highly competitive. If you wanted to shop at this store, you needed this bank. If you wanted to go to this store, you needed a different bank's credit card. And they were in this web of regulations that was strangling them. And back in those days, they were losing about $10 million a day, which was a huge amount. Probably not now. So all these credit cards with all these banks are competing. And he's the fellow that came up with Visa. And the way he did it was he developed, and it was according to indigenous economic principles. Everybody owns Visa, but nobody can sell it. Every bank has an equal vote no matter what its size is. No banks can form overpowering cliques or collateral cooperatives in the voting. The structure itself is both your supervisor, your labor, you're all your producer, you're all aspects within the structure. It's fascinating. And what it proved is distribution is possible. The principles were designed for the widest distribution of credit. As I'm not talking wealth. Please don't misunderstand that. It's not a story about distribution of wealth or resources. It's a story about distribution of credit, but at a phenomenal scale. So there is a way to do this. I'm not sure what it would take for the political will. And one of the pieces I did in looking at this, I was curious about trying to see if I could distribute some in the financial market, if I could do something. And the fascinating part on this, Rachel, was there are asset owners or shareholders, stock holders that really want the values behind their money and how they invest their money. and it's in Europe under environmental social governance. It's here now under I go back into the old days when it was called social investing, and the impetus for it was really, well, I was on the first mutual fund that was socially invested, the Calvert Social Investment Fund. But what really launched it was divestment from South Africa. And it was the political will to stop the insanity and to react and use the market in a way that forced values. And you can kind of see why the pushback on values is so huge. They're scared the Jesus out of them that we would push values into the market. That's what this anti-woke reaction is all about. Back then, a huge movement in the market was, wait a minute, I'm going to use my money according to my values. And we've seen it refined to today. Like I said, when you start looking at the environmental, social, and governance framework for analyzing risk, it is far superior to anything else they have as point in time with price ratios and earnings, because it does allow, this framework in and of itself allows you some interconnected. It's not perfect, but it begins to understand the interconnection between the risks in the market. Now, that's on a practical side, on my own personal side, and hallelujah, it starts bringing values in. Because one of the major hurdles we have to get over is this is not a value neutral economy. There's no such thing as a value neutral economy. So we should take a stand on making sure we have the values, minimal values of humanity and life that are in the economy. That sharing and that distribution led to thousands and thousands of years of sustainability. And the goal of an indigenous economy is sustainability. And the agricultural techniques are for diversity of crops instead of monocropping. I mean, when you start pulling all these pieces together, you see the ultimate picture that is built is one of sustainability and taking care, meeting the most needs for the most people.
When you were talking about redistribution of wealth, something that came to mind was this idea that you have already brought up, redistributing wealth back to Mother Earth too, this idea of reciprocity. So I've read Braiding Sweetgrass. I'm sure a lot of our listeners have. If you haven't, I would highly recommend it. And the practice of asking the earth every time if we may take. So if you're going, foraging for a herb, indigenous cultures will not take the first one that they find. They will find the plant that is willing to be taken, and they will offer tobacco. They will leave something in exchange, and they will ask, is it all right for me to harvest you, for me to take you? And they listen. And that idea of redistributing back to Mother Earth as well, to the big system of life, to take care of her in order to be in balance with one another, in order to be in harmony. It is so distressing to hear at the utmost political levels, the top, that such designs could only work on a small scale or aren't feasible given, the world that we live in today or anything like that, because it is the only way that you sustain life, truly. Respecting the world around you is the only way that you sustain life.
You nailed it. I mean, and one of the sort of caveats that they always do bring in is scale. They're always talking about scale or technology, that it's just a mere fact that they have the technology at a scale now that could cause damage, but don't worry, they're going to have technology that'll fix it all too sometime. Here, look down the road.
Mm-hmm. GDP.
Quite a spin, isn't it? It's like the spin messaging here. From the get-go, if you looked at production in an indigenous economy, and then you go, let's jump to the Western one too. It's maximum yield over here with the Western economy. Maximum yield. If you're looking over here, any kind of production was taken in a harvesting sense when it was at the best time. So like when the animals were the most plentiful. And you can follow this if I were a better or any kind of a botanist, I could take you through how nut groves work. So that there are years when the trees just overproduce for whatever reasons Mother Nature has mixed up. You got, bam, everything going. That's the year you take the most. You don't go back and try to make it all the same. But you also, when you take, there's a real clear giving back, a reciprocity where once you're done, you go back and you either, in some cases, you're burying fish for nutrients. In some cases, you're grinding up the shells in that and bringing them back to the mother tree. In some cases, you're just spiritually tamping the energy back into Mother Earth that you feel that was represented in the food she gave you. The other part which breaks my heart is our meat industry right now. It would be unheard of to treat another sentient being and not respect their life that they're giving for your sustenance. So even in that relationship, there was a reciprocity of tremendous respect and honoring of the life that they gave for your life. So that at every point when you're understanding the way you carry yourself in the world, you're looking at a partnership, a true relationship. Again, in the whole, and how you conduct yourself. Now, if you look at the meat industry, and you start with, 6 companies, I think, on all the meat labels out there, and you begin to look at the profits.
A blog release from the White House in the United States in 2021 says that just 4 meat companies control 55 to 85% of the market on pork, beef, and poultry, and they are taking advantage of this uncompetitive market power, raising prices on consumers, underpaying farmers, and increasing their profits. The companies are JBS, Marfrig, Tyson, and Seaboard.
Every one of our corporations over here at this point, Rachel, is having historic, not just record-breaking for this quarter or this year or the past 5 years, but their entire existence, they're having historic record-breaking profits. That is the prime example of extractive without any reciprocity, because there's, and then you, I'm getting crazy when I talk about this, because you're looking at, okay, all this is going up into the company. It's not even going into the people who work in the company. It's kind of going to the C-suite and the shareholders. And then you get to the fact that most money is abstract anyway. It's no longer tied to actual production. I'm sorry, I can't even first start going through this thing. I feel like I'm in the rabbit hole. Just call me Alice. I mean, it's like, gosh. So now we're in this finance system that in the past 15 years grew to the 3rd largest sector out of the 13 sectors in the market. And it's just through stock appreciation, primarily. Yeah. It's not through anything productive. And yet it's growing at a phenomenal rate. So now we're making all of this out of nothing, and we still refuse to share it or pay back on it. It's mind-boggling. That's why I call it an addiction, because there's no explanation for how people are behaving in the market except for addiction, where this is something that's not good for us. And we still continue to return to it all the time to get our fix. I don't know how else to describe it.
Violence. It is pure violence. And I wish if there was some message that I could take to the world for me, it would be violence does not discriminate. You cannot contain violence in one place and not have it leak out. So you mentioned, the industrial agriculture. So our treatment of, conscious, sentient, feeling beings in order to produce often not even nutritious food, essentially to feed other forms of addiction. I read a really fascinating paper this week that showed this belief in human supremacy over animals and human supremacy over nature that is very much sort of facilitated and perpetuated by our relationship to meat. It has been shown to correlate with increased levels of sexism and increased levels of ethnic prejudice. So that violence that we feel towards the natural world, and I'm using the royal we here, but that violence that can occur in the sense of I, as a human being, am entitled to take, to exploit, to extract, to kill, to cause pain, because I am the master of this planet. that then leaks out. I mean, first of all, that's an awful thing in and of itself, but it leaks out into how then people of different races treat one another, in particular white supremacy. It leaks out into men's treatment of women. We cannot live so extractively and so violently and not have it come back on us at some point.
We're absolutely seeing, we're reaping what we've sowed in this sense of what you're talking about. If we continue to see this worldview that ranks in everything in it, I mean, the low form is going to be the plants, and then you got maybe minerals in there, even plants, maybe minerals, plants, whatever. But then you get to humans at the top. But then they don't stop there. There's certain humans, not all humans, like you're saying. So you have this mindset that you're in a position to make those judgments. Now, the way this goes back to and I always say it's not a coincidence. She's Mother Earth. In what you just described, this is not a coincidence. And Mother Earth, as all mothers, are the giver of life. And it goes back to what you so eloquently said just in the beginning about this is a destruction and death model that we're in now. And that's why I go back to say it's an addiction, because we're in a market that's about to destroy us and we're still hooked on it. So when you talk about financializing nature, to bring it back to the beginning, it really scares the bejesus out of me, because we have no evidence whatsoever that would lead us to believe this can be done any other way than the way it's going right now. And we put it in this system of values, which values one thing and one thing only, and that's the extractive purpose or profit they can get out of it. Like it's like a meat grinder. All else gets just chewed up and spit out the other end. So the concept that that's not going to affect us, I mean, we see it everywhere we turn. We see about the wars we're in. We see about how many women, I think, 3 women a minute or something? I don't know, a phenomenal rate of women are being killed in our country.
3 women are killed each day in the United States by an intimate partner, according to the Violence Policy Center.
Well, what can I say about our country? The fact that we refuse to ban assault weapons, that we don't even care enough for our kids because assault weapons have a profit margin. And again, here's where we sit with all of this. We need to really look at those enclaves where there are values of community, values of humanity, and we need to begin to build around there. One of the healthiest parts of an economy is to have some localized production. You don't want everything to be outside your community. I mean, they're starting to see that in a national sense now. We're bringing semiconductors back in, and that we need to begin to build that fabric locally. And we need to tie our financing to our production. And then we need to really set some limits on the accumulation. I mean, there's plenty of techniques in the market where this accumulation can be curbed. It's not that everybody has to have the same dollar amount, but we have to set limits in a range where it exists. Some people might be some bit wealthier than other people's, but you don't have, 6 of the wealthiest people have more assets and wealth than 97 countries?
I wasn't able to find this exact statistic, but I did find that a recent report from Oxfam on inequality says the 5 richest men on the planet have doubled their wealth since 2020 and own more than $800 billion US. And the richest 1% of the global population owns 43% of all global financial assets.
It's mind-boggling. Elon Musk can start a war. He can turn a satellite off. We're at a point now where we're at a tipping point with financializing everything. I don't believe we should count on some kind of technology that we can pay more money for. A little robot bee that's going to go around and pollinate everything. We're going to have to pay money for the robot bee. That's what, when they start talking about, when you look at the conservation people and they talk about, they've got a figure, I think they're getting $173 billion a year now, I think. $173 billion in a year to take care of protected areas. And what they need is $482 billion as a projected cost to take care. Nature takes care of herself if you leave her alone.
Yes.
So again, they're financializing that actually, why? As I said, this makes as much sense as killing all the bees and then building robots. Bees we have to pay for. Now we're going to kill all of nature, and you and I are going to have to buy air because we're coming to that now with the pollution and the wildfires and everything. We're coming to air quality issues. We have to buy water because we already got water quality issues. We're going to have to chunk off each of these pieces, and you and I are going to have to start buying them when this gets into full motion. When, in fact, it's all here now. And they are the one. We need an economy that is put into a place of our need, not us into their needs. And I do think it can be done. I mean, I go back to the shareholders. I did a product once. I started off calling it high social impact investing, and then that politics of socialism. So it got changed to community notes. But I put it on the market, and it allows investors and pension funds, any asset managers, to invest in these community notes, which then are reinvested into community financial institutions, the microloan funds. We've got close to $1 billion in community notes now, all from the private sector.
Amazing.
There are investors out there that want this. Rachel, there are a lot, and the generations that are, forget about me, the next generations are coming on strong, and they really want this stuff. And right now, we have a market that's doing greenwashing. Right at this moment, everyone listening to this should really demand authentic investing, ESG investing. Demand it and push your brokers, push your financial planners, and make it shareholder buy-in, because they're pushing back saying the shareholders don't want it. If the shareholders say they want it, this market's supposed to run on shareholder buy-in. And I would say that's probably the singular most thing of power that we have right now. So I really got on a soapbox there, but I do think it's important leverage.
Great. I'm enthralled. And there you go. Everyone listening, you have your takeaway, you have your notes. Go and hammer your financial planner if you have one, or your neighbor if he's one, or whatever, and tell them what to do. I agree. I speak to people sometimes who have a lot of wealth and who are looking for something to do. There is not this ideological divide that everybody who has is bad and everybody who doesn't have is good. A lot of people are trapped within an inherited system as well. And they don't want to give up what they have, but they are totally willing to put it to good work if they can just find the place to do that. So thank you very much for your work in creating these options. I think we've done the wild tour of all of that. Rebecca, thank you so much for your work and for your time.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much for the platform. And thank you, viewers and listeners, for the time you're giving to us.
This is a jam-packed discussion, as we just mentioned. So there's a lot we could talk about here, but where do you want to start with it first?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. I think maybe just a shout out to Rebecca's amazing enthusiasm and her passion and her knowledge. The fact that, how do I say this? I think it's really important to recognize the fact that there are a lot of people who are doing this work who are only now getting the recognition that they should, because they grew up in a different era when there was still, there's still a huge amount of racism and sexism today, but where that kind of racism and sexism impeached them from getting access to spaces. And so, Rebecca is in her 70s and she is doing this work, and she has been fighting for decades to be able to do this work and to be heard and to be seen. And so to have so much enthusiasm and passion and love for the world, despite those trials and tribulations, I think that's probably where I would like to start, as a kind of thanking the people like her who have fought all this time.
Yeah, her story is really remarkable. I was, researching it because I didn't know as much about it as I should have, and yeah, it's incredible and inspiring for sure. And I also thought the principles of indigenous economic systems that she brought up were really awesome. The example she gave of Visa, I did not know that was that was based on that. I had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I had so many thoughts about that. What did you think about that?
I had no idea either. I was totally blown away by it. And it is funny because when she was like, there's not enough time in an episode to do all things, right?
Right.
But what I think was quite an interesting example about Visa is it's such an amazing example of collaboration in order to achieve something that benefited those corporations then. However, there's a South African writer who wrote a book called Cloud Money. His name is Brett Scott.
I interviewed him.
Oh, you're into Brett. Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, then the listeners will know.
If you want to listen to that conversation, it was published August 8th, 2022. It's titled Bitcoin, Blockchain, and Burgeoning Energy Use. Indeed, Scott talks about how our financial systems are all tied back to the environment.
But I mean,
Yeah.
his work is awesome. And in it, he kind of details how Visa and MasterCard are actually really examples of kind of this like corporate takeover of our financial systems that make us really, really vulnerable because we don't have very many options to choose from. So it's really interesting how like you can have these examples of collaboration and like indigenous intention, but within this kind of gross profit incentive system, it will get corrupted eventually.
Yeah. And so I think it's important for us to highlight a couple of things she said in there.
Mm-hmm.
Two things really stuck out to me. She said indigenous systems are focused on fulfilling the most needs for the most people. And in the case of Visa, at least when it was originally created, everyone owns it, but no one can sell it. So those two things really stuck out to me. What did you think about that?
I would love if we lived in a world where we couldn't really sell anything. I think that's an well, think about it. I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah.
Like if you're creating things because they are fulfilling a need, and then having an economic system of reciprocity, which is the word I think in the interview that stood out for me. So reciprocity with Mother Earth. I think that's absolutely great. And then, I mean, creating a thing that helps the most people that are in need. It's Marxist. And there's a reason why, a whole bunch of countries around the world and a whole bunch of people around the world wanted to trial that system because it sounds pretty good.
Well, I mean, and there's sort of, I think there are actually examples right now, maybe they're not quite as robust as they could be, but there are like social safety nets, for example, that sort of, are based on that principle. Like, for instance, here in Australia, we have Medicare. It's certainly not perfect, and people are slowly chipping away at it, but it's quite remarkable for what it is. And it seems to be incorporating some of those principles, like fulfilling the most needs for the most people.
Absolutely. I mean, if we want to keep using the healthcare system, look at the NHS in the United Kingdom, the National Health Service, which, just as a quick note for listeners, I think is a really important part of its story. The NHS has existed for about 100 years, and it was not a gradual process of going from a kind of private, broken, fragmented health service to a national one that is free for everybody.
To be precise, it was officially established in 1948. However, it built upon components established in the National Insurance Act of 1911.
They turned it on overnight. That was how fast that system changed. And it has been possibly, I think it's the thing when you poll Brits, it's one of the things that we are most proud of and we would most like to save.
According to an Ipsos poll from 2016, it is number 1 on the list of things that make Britons proud to be British.
And it just goes to show that something that is done for the benefit of people can also be, it was the best health service in the world, essentially, before the Conservatives took power 12 years ago and ruined it. And it was a public service in which everything was free. So it can all be done very, very well. Indigenous economics, it makes sense. It makes sense. Yeah. I think it is a very sort of normal way of organizing. And anybody that's read anything by like David Graeber and David Wengrow will recognize that those kinds of baseline values still provide a huge amount of ways to diversely organize your economic systems, to create them sort of culturally independent and resilient and interesting. It doesn't mean that you get one homogenous system rolled out, but really beginning with a baseline value or motivation that is different to the one that we're in today. I think a lot of people would agree nowadays that that's probably what we need to be looking at if we're going to overhaul the economic system in a way that protects the natural world.
Not to go too much on a tangent here, Rachel, but
please
it
do.
sort of makes me... this might be too much of a tangent, so we'll see. It sort of reminds me of communication streams or platforms like Twitter. Imagine if Twitter couldn't be sold and it was owned by everybody, because it was a crucial communication tool for so many people that I know, and particularly people who are in non-industrialized nations who use it to communicate with other, journalists or activists or scientists. Getting that platform usurped by someone like Elon Musk was extremely damaging for global communication. And I just think it breaks my heart to think about, like, God, what if that couldn't have been sold?
Yeah.
What if it could have remained at least what it was, the functionality of it, and instead we have what it is now.
Totally. And I don't think it's a big leap to imagine a world of public ownership, because we still, even despite our kind of like totally deregulated markets, governments still step in to corporate deals. So we have, in the United States, heavy on the antitrust laws to try and ensure that corporations don't monopolize an industry, because then that would reveal that, the free market maybe isn't all it's cracked up to be. So it's actually really, really normal for a government to keep a very, very close eye on industry. And if anything happens that might actually impact the overall market or nation, they will stop deals. And so if we just use that same framework that exists, but flipped the motivation so that rather than it was being about causing harm to the market, if it was about what are things that are going to cause good to the public, it's not actually that big a difference legally, but it completely changes the framework with which we're approaching what our economies exist for and who they serve.
And on that note, the financialization of nature, I think, as you both talked about at length, it's even just difficult to think about putting a number on basically all of life. It's just kind of absurd, let alone thinking about putting a number on like a specific ecosystem or even a specific species. There's just so much intrinsic value that experts I have spoken with argue is incalculable, because you can't ever really fully know if there's like a dollar amount you could attach that to. There's just too many intrinsic factors at play.
It really hurts my brain when people try and do these huge calculations about like nature as just an asset class. And so to put a price of the entirety of the world, as she was saying, and I can't remember the figure now off the top of my head.
4,000 trillion.
There we go. $4,000 trillion.
Again, small correction, this number is actually $5,000 trillion.
I mean, who in their right mind is calculating that as if it was a couple of dollars extra, we wouldn't pay to protect it because we could survive without it? It is just mind-boggling. And I'm sure, as we sort of say in the episode, it only goes sort of to show how divorced our economic systems and our biosphere is. But it's pervasive. It is totally pervasive. I'm gonna tangent here, right? I ended up meeting someone last night from the state of Washington. They work in AI, and we got into all of this very, very quickly, essentially. And this person was talking about the fact that the price of things will be right. We will pay. Yeah, we're like us human beings, we're a little bit slow to the party and stuff, but we will pay to do the right thing when we need to. And when the kind of tech is available, that is going to help us. And I was like, well, there's a lot of, examples to suggest that might not be true. Like, the lack of investment in renewables, despite the fact that they're increasingly the cheapest form of energy because investors can't get the highest return, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually it boiled, the conversation boiled right down to the sense of, but we will, he was like, we will pay. And I said, with what money? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, if our ecosystems collapse and if nature gets destroyed and if all of these, things happen, which are currently happening, but just get increasingly worse, where are we going to get the money to pay to mitigate or adapt all of these damages? that we're causing. And he just kept saying, but we will pay. And I said, no. But where does money come from? And people all over the world, especially I would say in sort of, like privileged markets that maybe have worked in the service economy their entire lives, really, really struggle to grasp that money is something real. Like, we have created a kind of relationship to it, and it's a figment of our imagination in many sense. But the fact that you have money means that it came from the destruction of the natural world at some point. And if we keep destroying the natural world, then how are we going to drum up the biggest investment in the history of mankind to protect it? It's an equation that doesn't make sense.
On page 21 in Brett Scott's book, Cloud Money, he explains this financial connection with nature with the following. High finance feels ever present and yet ever divorced from our lives. But the complex networks of finance can always, in the end, be traced back to our bodies and to the earth. Indeed, everything in the final analysis is derived from our ecological systems, without which we perish. If I walk to a park, lie on the grass and look down, I will see mites crawling through soil particles. And if I could sink deeper, I would see microbes, fungi, and molecules of water. This is the substratum that gives birth to the plants, which give life to countless creatures, all arranged in ecosystems that have allowed us to survive for over 200,000 years, raising children, forming communities, and producing goods and services, or value.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something that Brett Scott talked with me about. Like, entire industries, sectors are all based on nature, using the earth. Coral reefs, for example, is the source of revenue for so many industries. And as those continue to die off, those industries will go along with it in some cases, in many cases. So your question to him is so valid. Here, where I am in Australia, we have a biodiversity offset scheme where developers who destroy ecosystems can pay to, quote unquote, offset the damage to ecosystems, of which the full value we don't even understand in the first place. Yeah. And the state auditor general basically criticized it and says, you can't even fulfill the demand for the offsets in the first place, and making sure that they are monitored properly is a real challenge. So, and I'm actually doing a newscast episode on that. It'll come out after this one, or maybe it came out before this one. I don't know. But yeah, so big complications with financializing or like turning nature into a market is a really big problem in the first place.
Yeah. And not understanding that she's the baseline of all markets to begin with. The offsetting thing is wild. Rebecca and I didn't really go into it because, again, we don't have a lot of time. But for people who are interested, we've got a newscast episode on carbon offsetting and how the UN carbon credits turn out to be a scam, which people can listen to. And that provides a lot of detail into it.
We interviewed Jacob Goldberg from the New Humanitarian about the issues with the United Nations climate neutrality claims, many of which relied on carbon credits. This was published October 10th, 2023.
But on the biodiversity offsetting, biodiversity offset markets have been proven to cause more harm to nature than a hindrance. And the whole system behind them is absolutely wild. You've got, if I may, just very quickly for our listeners.
Sure.
You've got a like-for-like offset or a like-for-like or better offset. And this is the framework that's being put into policy in the European Union and that experts are really, really warning about. For anybody who's really interested in this kind of stuff, I would recommend checking it. The Green Finance Observatory, they do independent research and publish papers all the time and really keep an eye on what's going on around the world with regards to these offset markets. So the like-for-like offset means that, for example, if I want to build an airport in Spain and I have to destroy a flamingo habitat to do that, then I'm going to have to protect a flamingo habitat somewhere else. That's the like-for-like. The like-for-like or better across Europe, for example, or this could be, you could imagine this across the United States, it's a huge territory, or across Australia, it's a huge territory. If I want to destroy a flamingo habitat in Spain in order to build my airport, I can then protect bats in Greece as my like-for-like or better biodiversity offset option, as if nature and pieces of ecosystems are entirely substitutable. And this is the danger with financialization. You put a number on a thing and you actually kind of destroy its real relationships to everything else around it. It's dynamic, organic relationships to everything around it. And I mean, it doesn't take, a broad leap of the imagination to understand just how disastrous that could be. We could have essentially biodiversity dead zones in Europe and then biodiversity hot zones. We could create this huge divide. But on the books, all of our biodiversity would be adequately protected because it would have been balanced with our offsets. It's madness.
It is. We don't have a ton of time left, Rachel, and I might cut this next part out, but I'm just going to throw it out there just in case you're interested in it. So if you have time, that is.
Yeah.
So I looked up you remember that meeting that Rebecca talked about that happened in Italy with the 5 big religions meeting and trying to come up with a declaration on nature?
Yes.
So I looked it up. I was just kind of curious to see what each religion said about nature, and there was some stuff in here, I gotta say. And keep in mind, this happened in 1986. So 1986 is the year I was born, by the way, folks. That's a long time ago. So I looked up what each religion said, and the Catholic Church actually had a really interesting statement. So I'm going to read.
Do you know what, Mike? From your tone of voice, I really can't tell which way this is going to go yet. Is it going to be really good or really bad?
Let me just read this to you. This is interesting. Many are the causes of the ecological disaster which mankind faces today. Without pretending to be complete, the following should be singled out. Uncontrolled use of technology for immediate economic growth, with little or no consideration for the planet's resources and their possible renewal, disregard for just and peaceful relations among peoples, destruction of cultures and environment during war, ill-considered exploitation of natural resources by consumer-oriented societies, unmastered and unregulated urbanization, and the exclusive preoccupation with the present without any regard for the future quality of life.
What a nice, delicate answer. Yes, it is rather comprehensive. But do you know what? Do you know what's quite interesting about that? There's been some amazing research that's come out of the University of Colorado that showed that in the 90s, even the media coverage of the ecological crisis was far more comprehensive than it has been in recent decades because it wasn't a partisan issue. And essentially this isn't research, but the vibe, the hypothesis is that, what was his name? The guy who lost to George Bush, but who actually won the popular vote, Al Gore.
Yeah.
That Al Gore running essentially made it a partisan divide. That's kind of the vibes hypothesis, not the actual scientific hypothesis. So in a sense, it doesn't surprise me that institutions were comprehensively understanding what was going on even in the 80s. But guys, if you're going to talk the talk, you got to walk the walk as well.
It couldn't have said it better. The New York Times covered this, by the way. Also, the Hindu Declaration said this sentence: "What is needed today is to remind ourselves that nature cannot be destroyed without mankind ultimately being destroyed itself." A little bit dated using mankind there, but you get the statement.
Yeah. So much wisdom. Yeah. Where are they now?
Not sure. I mean, this was, as I said, 37 years ago, so perhaps some of these folks may not still be with us.
But I think that it's a really, really important thing to know. It's really important for this to be reminded of this kind of thing happening in the 80s, or limits to growth being published in the 70s. Mm-hmm. It's that progress is not always linear. It's not that we're in the best position ever to be fighting climate change and injustice and all this kind of stuff. There's a lot of there's enough to suggest that 3 decades ago, we were doing better on this in many respects. And actually things went downhill. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is we constantly need to have the momentum up and to understand our history of where we've come from, because just because something pierces the public consciousness does not mean that the win is inevitable, essentially.
I think that's a great place to end this conversation on. Anyway, I love this episode. Really, really great job, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Mike. This was great.
If you want to read more on Rebecca Adamson and her work, you can find links provided in the show notes. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay newscast or any of our podcast content like our sister series Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is definitely the best way to help expand our reach, but you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so even just $1 per month really makes a difference and helps us offset production costs. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, go to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded this podcast well over 500,000 times by subscribing to it wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. But you can also read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or you can follow us on social media. Find Mongabay via our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News and on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thank you, as always, for listening.